Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us. Tonight, we've got a very interesting session lined up. Marx, Marxism, and the women's question. We called it actually Marxism and the women's question because it's not just Marx who said interesting things, but chiefly Engels and Bebels and Clara Zetkin. And Irish Marxist Anne McShane, who's joining us tonight, will look at them and outline the approach in about 45 minutes. And then we can open up, as always, to questions and comments from the floor. If you want to ask a question or make a comment, please click the raise hand button that's under reactions. There you go. Without further ado, Anne, thanks for joining us.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Tina. I'm just going to give a little warning at the beginning that there may be dog noises. Well, there'll be at some stage, so I might have to mute. Hopefully it won't last too long. But it's just the end of the day and the dogs are coming home.
Yes, they're coming home by themselves, walking
home, ringing the bell. Anyway, okay, so, all right, well, in many ways, I think I have to say that this question is not one that really you can deal with in one session, because for me, the woman question and Marxism are intertwined because of the fact that Marxism is a project for universal liberation and for a collective approach to all aspects of our lives. I think that the woman question has to be an essential part of all debates and all research and writings on the question. Okay. But nevertheless, I think beginning this discussion is important, and I'm glad to be able to do so. So, okay, so Marx and Marxism on the woman question. Well, firstly, as many people will perhaps know, Marx himself did not write specifically on the woman question at any stage. He did, however, write on questions connected to women's rights and women's position within capitalist society. And you can pick up from his writings various strands in it that connect with an approach on the question, which was developed afterwards, after his death by Friedrich Engels and also by August Bebel. So Marx's initial writings, which included reflections on the relationship of men and women and the role of the family, would be seen in philosophical and anthropological studies, and also writings in Grundrisse and other writings of that nature, which would be, like, as I said, like more like a philosophical examination of human society and how human society has developed. And also within that study, the question which would have been very important for Marx in other talks in these seminars, people have spoken about Marx and alienation. And I think that, again, at the core of Marx's study was the question of human beings and our alienation from nature, our alienation from our natural self, and the struggle to reunite and reintegrate what he would have said man, but he would have meant humanity and nature. And therefore, the early communist society, sometimes called primitive communist society, would have been a state which Marx, when he read about the research that had been conducted by a man called Charles Morgan, would have understood that this society reflected humanity in its natural self, in its natural state. then in Capital, in Marx's writings in Capital, he would have looked at the relationship of the family to capitalism, and the fact that within the family there was the reproduction of labor, both in terms of the maintenance of the proletariat on a daily basis. It's, you know, it's being fed, maintained, clothed, in order that the proletariat worked and sold their labor power to capitalism in order to produce surplus value and then profits, and also the reproduction of the proletariat in the sense of their actually being born, in terms of women reproducing new forces that would be sent into the factories in order to make surplus value. So that two-pronged approach within the family. And I think that Marx argued that the wage of the laborer provided for, you know, their food and their housing and etc., but there was also a free aspect of that, which was the work done by women in the home, which was unpaid. Now, okay, so then I want to move on to talk about the main area in which Marxism has made a contribution on the woman question. And that has been specifically the book written by Friedrich Engels, which most people will be familiar with, and which, sorry, my copy is here, Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State. There was also a book by August Bebel, which was written earlier, called Woman Under Socialism. These were both analyses based on a reading of a book called Ancient Society, written by Morgan. So Morgan was an anthropologist who studied a tribe of Iroquois people in New York State in the mid-1800s, and he lived with these people and he studied their ways of life. And what he deducted from his study was that earlier women and men had lived in entirely different relations with each other, and that the Iroquois Indian tribe had moved on from the earlier form in which they'd lived, but still bore the hallmarks of that earlier society. And this society, he argued, was a collective one in which men and women lived together in different forms of the family. Now, I'm not going to go into the exact kind of way in which he set out the development of this family, and Engels does it. He has a critical approach to Morgan because he thinks Morgan is too, like, Morgan believes that society is always progressing, so we're always moving forward, and he believed that the problems that came about with the collapse of primitive communism and the rise of profit-making society would be resolved through human progress, whereas obviously Engels thought differently and believed that you needed a revolution. Anyway, so basically, Marx had studied Morgan and had made notes on Morgan, and I've already given Tina the reference to Marx's ethnological notebooks, where Marx's marginal notes are included, and there's been an attempt to kind of systematically put these together to show how Marx approached these questions. But I'm mostly focusing on Engels, because Engels wrote his book after Marx's death by drawing on these notebooks and by developing his own ideas also on the question. And if you're one of those people that believes that Marx was, you know, far superior to Engels, and Engels was dogmatic, was wooden in his approach, etc., then you perhaps take the view that what Marx wrote, even though it was only in margin notes, was more superior to what Engels wrote. But I disagree. I believe that they were a team. Obviously, each of them had their own strengths and weaknesses, but they were united in an approach to society, to capitalism, and to the manner in which society develops and provides the basis of a revolution and a transformation to socialism, which I think informed both Marx's earlier studies, for a book that he didn't manage to produce, and Engels's book itself. So, okay, so basically, as I've already said, the view based on Morgan's work and other anthropological studies that were available at the time was that early human society had been a collective communal society, where the division of labor was based on the requirements of that society. And that also what you saw in the anthropological findings that threw light on this early society was that it had moved from being a society based on a group form of marriage to a society based on a pairing couple, which also remained within a collective group. Now, Chris Nye, some of you may know, and the Radical Anthropological Society group have produced a lot of work on these questions. And Chris has written a book called Blood Relations, which I would recommend that all comrades read. There are other books, Mothers and Others, which show that what Morgan was saying at the time was actually correct, that early human society was collective, was a social society. There wasn't private property, and human beings lived in a very different relation to each other. So that this society marked the coming into being of humans from apes, and that it developed away from forms of society, like forms of practices like incest, etc., through the development of taboos, into a situation where there was a pairing family which lived collectively within the group. Now, of course, they were limited by what was available to them at the time, but the basic analysis was that human society had not always been the same. Human beings were not by nature selfish, greedy creatures, that actually human nature was far more likely to be a social, collective, kind of society where people helped each other out, where they worked together. Rather than one where we were atomized and driven into competition with each other, as exists today under capitalism, and indeed did in the 1800s also, where workers vied with each other for jobs, for position, etc. So, as well as studying the writing of Morgan, Engels also looked at what was available from other historians such as Bachofen, and also looked at early Roman society, Greek society, and the development of the family overall within these societies. So what we have is Marx and Engels taking an approach to society insofar as they're trying to understand how we developed to the stage of class society, and that this provided the basis on which to understand class society and how we could break free of it. So that therefore they looked at these other societies that came after early communism, and looked at like the way in which the previous forms remained reflected or were subverted within the societies which came after it. So, for instance, Marx did some reading about the clans in Ireland and how they developed, and how, you know, and how the clans would have had forms that reflected a society which had been matriarchal, which is the thing actually I haven't spoken about yet. That early communist society had been matriarchal, so that basically all members of that society trace their lineage back through their mothers rather than their fathers, and that this meant that that women's position within society was a highly respected one, because they produced human beings. You know, that was their primary function in life, you know, as a physical task, and that they were respected because of that, and also that they were respected because of the work they did within society in terms of taking the primary responsibility for looking after children and also for preparation of food, whereas men were also involved in looking after children for certain, but they took the role of hunting more. But the whole way in which society works was that each aspect will complement each other. So as I said, it wasn't simply the fact that you had this early society which collapsed and, you know, there was nothing left of it, but that it did collapse with the development of private property, but that many of its forms continued to be reflected in societies which came after it. So basically, when early communism moved from being a hunter-gatherer society, i.e. a society that was based on scarcity, to a society where there was a development of a surplus, then things changed markedly for the people of that society. So when, in particular, there was a development of cattle herding, then the situation changed. So, like, we can see examples today still of nomadic tribes, although there are very few of them that continue to exist. But we'll say the nomadic tribes of the steppes of the former Soviet Union or Mongolia, that they would retain, you know, some aspects of the society that developed after the collapse of communism. And that this society was a patriarchal society because, firstly, the creation of a surplus through cattle herding, as opposed to going out and hunting and getting whatever meat you needed for that day or that week or whatever, that development meant that although at first the collective would have managed to like retain its cohesion around the surplus and, you know, to divide it out between them, with the development of the surplus, there also became tensions in relation to who owned it. And with that, there became the development of competition between group members and between leading individuals within families. And women, because of their position in the old society, in the old communist society, would not have been in a position to own any of the surplus that came about. They would not have been the owners of the herds. They would have been the producers of the children and the producers of the basic everyday needs. They wouldn't have been involved with this. So this put men, therefore, in a position of leadership within the commune, and for women in a position of subservience for the first time. So therefore, you had, coming out of the old commune, the development of new forms like clans, which were patriarchal, which there would still be the father and the uncles and the brothers all living together, but the women were also collectively in there, but in a subservient position. So whereas before within the commune, when the pairing family came together, the man would either have gone to live with the woman's gens, the woman's kind of gens would being the kind of smaller groups, the component groups that made up the commune, or else they would have stayed with their own family. Now, with patriarchy, women went from their own gens to the male one. So women, and then, of course, increasingly became a part of property themselves, a property themselves that would be sold into the patriarchy, the patriarchal family of the husband, by their family, and bought by them as well. So they became part of the property of the patriarchal clan. Okay, so at this stage in his book, Engels talks about the way in which women were abducted by men in this particular stage of post-communist society, and he describes it as the historic defeat of the female sex. And this term has been taken up by some who are critical of Engels, and it's argued that this was a very dogmatic thing to say, that it didn't reflect the fact that even after the collapse of primitive communism, women continue to struggle in societies for their demands. But I don't think that this is the case. I think that what Engels is trying to do is to say, look, this marked an important defeat, not just for women, actually, but also for society as a whole. And that this did not mean that there wasn't a struggle for women's rights, but it was within a class society from now on, and within a patriarchal class society. And women went from being highly respected within communism to being subservient and treated like another piece of property of the man, and that could be bought and sold. So that was a huge change. Of course, it happened over many generations. It didn't happen overnight, but nevertheless, it marked a huge defeat for women. Okay, so just moving on now to discuss the lessons which Engels and Babel and others drew from the work of Morgan. So they basically they saw the change in the situation of where men owns the property, and women were subservient within the home, where the home went from being somewhere which was part of the entire collective and was respected and necessary, within the collective to being an isolated, individualized form as being extremely important. Because when they were looking at the woman question, they were essentially looking at the operation of the family and women's position within the family. So basically, domestic labor was no longer collectivized. Childcare was no longer collectivized. This was the responsibility of the woman within the home, or of course within tribes, the responsibility of the women within the home, and it was undervalued and seen as something that was really of very little importance to society overall, because society overall was dominated by the need for surplus and the making of profits at a later stage with the development of capitalism. So, okay, so what did this mean in terms of like the future? It didn't mean that they believed that there should be the old society kind of that old form of primitive communism, of early communism, would be the future. But what it meant was that they could see how future society needed to change and how we needed to struggle for a future society in order to move back towards nature, and to put society in a position where women and men would work together collectively without the idea that one work was less important than the other, or where women didn't have the same rights as men. So for Bebel, Victorian society in Germany, which was obviously didn't have Queen Victoria, but had a similar form of the family, where for the bourgeoisie, the man went out to work or conducted his business, and the woman was in the house and she had her servants, but she didn't do anything. She was more kind of like decoration than anything else. They saw that this society was on its way out, and indeed they're right, it was on its way out. They saw the working class family as something far more positive, because although the woman in the working class family was had to face like a double burden of labor and had enormous difficulties in coping at that time as a worker because of the conditions of work, because of the lack of facilities for childcare, etc., etc. Nevertheless, they thought the woman is now working, she's out of the home, she's in a social situation, she's generally working with men, although I think that that wasn't actually really always the case, but certainly they believed that women in the workplace was enormously positive, because it would mean that they could organize together with men, they could form trade unions, they could get involved in politics, and they could be part of social and political life within society. That this was a huge transformation from previously, where women had been basically in the home and tied to the home and not allowed to play a part in society. So Engels was quite optimistic about the possibilities of men and women being able to work together and to overcome women's oppression through their involvement together in the workplace. And indeed, he saw the possibility that capitalism itself would offer the opportunities of collectivization of various labor, of domestic labor and of childcare. He thought that society, for instance, the development of eating places, cafeterias, would become more dominant because capitalism needed women to work, and therefore they wouldn't be putting so much stress. Sorry about, there's the dog sound. They wouldn't be putting so much stress on the need for women to go home and cook and clean. But as we know, he was wrong about this. And I think he also did not foresee, of course, because he wasn't looking at a crystal ball, but he was perhaps too optimistic, that he didn't really foresee that the same problems between men and women within the home found their way into the workplace, and the divisions between men and women in the workplace became replicated. But what they did argue for was that a workers' state, any new workers' state, excuse me, had to immediately put in place equal rights under law for women. And then they had to set about making those laws a reality. So they argued for the collectivization of childcare and domestic labor, and that this, they put forward, like in Babel's book, he put forward various ideas about this, about the way in which these nurseries could be attached to workplaces, and the way in which, house cleaning and other activities could be done by groups of workers, so that women didn't have to do it. And what this would mean would be that women could get involved in society, and that women and men could be part of the whole discussion and organization of the new society. Of course, they didn't argue that women's liberation would immediately come about, but that they believed that this was the way in which to go. This was the way in which to bring it about. So just finally, I want to say a little bit about the Second International and about the work of Clara Zetkin and Alexandra Kollontai. So Clara Zetkin was actually a colleague, or comrade, I should say, of August Bebel. And August Bebel, as many of you will know, was a member of the Social Democratic Party, as was Zetkin, and he was a representative of the STP in the Reichstag, where he argued for many policies to assist women, and also he argued for, and I believe he won, he argued for, I'm not sure if he won, the decriminalization of homosexuality. Anyway, so Clara Zetkin was very familiar with Bebel's writing, and what she tried to do was to develop his writing in practice. So she and others in the party set up the Frauenbewegung, the women's movement, which was attached to and then became part of the Social Democratic Party. And this took place in the 1890s. And they began to work among women, among working class women, to recruit them to the party, and also to campaign for various demands for women, such as equal pay, such as safety in the workplace, maternity leave, the right for women to have time off if they were nursing babies, childcare, and other provisions. And in 1907, she was part of the Socialist International, and she and Kollontai were among a group who set up the first women's socialist conferences within the Second International. And there, one of their primary demands was for women's vote and for universal right to universal suffrage. So basically they were in battle there with some from the Fabian Society in England who were supporting the suffragettes, and argued for a phased approach to women's suffrage, so that the middle class or women with property would get it first, and then working class women would get it afterwards. But she and Kollontai actually won the vote, and others who supported her won the vote in the women's conferences and at the congresses of the Second International on this question, although it didn't mean a lot because the International was very poor at putting its policies and resolutions into practice, because it was divided between the reformists and the revolutionaries. And in fact, the English women at it, and the Fabian Society and the SLP, went and worked with the suffragettes and ignored the decisions made by the Second International. But the reason that I'm making this point and giving you this example is to deal with the question of feminism. So we've had these arguments before in other forums about whether the women of the Second International or the women of the communist movement were feminists, or were socialist feminists, were Marxist feminists, or where indeed feminism fits in. And I argue alongside actually Zetkin and Kollontai and others that they were not feminists. And the reason for that is, as I hope I've showed with the approach of Marx and Engels and others, was that the woman question wasn't just something that was separate, but it was at the heart of the struggle for socialism, and that it was at the heart of our understanding of society, because of the role of the family in relation to the rest of society, and basically the supersession of the existing family. And that when they argued against feminism in the Second International and the Third International, the Communist Women's Movement, they weren't just arguing against the suffragettes who wanted working class women to follow their lead. But what they were arguing was against the idea that women could obtain any kind of liberation within existing society. Yes, you should fight for that liberation, but you should do so in such a way that points towards socialism, and also that you needed to fight as a working class and to draw working class men into that struggle with you, that it should be as much a priority for them as it would be for women. Now, of course, there are problems with this, because in the Second International, and indeed in the Third International, and indeed today, we have a problem winning men over to take up women's emancipation as a priority for themselves, because of their own experience in society. They don't see the importance of it in the way that women do, and that has been my experience. And they need to be educated, they need to be taught how important it is, and they need to be won to this question, because it is as important for them, for women to be liberated, as it is for women themselves. Because as long as men continue to live in a society where women are subservient, men are also alienated, because they, like they are in a situation where they're not having the kind of relationships with the other half of society that they should be having, that they're not seeing them as equals in the struggle. And that, I think, is a very important point. In any event, it's not because I think that feminism is an evil thing. I just think that it's sectional, and I think that it doesn't deal with the bigger question of understanding our alienation within capitalism as a whole, and the need to overcome this. But in order to win over men on this struggle, we have to fight for that, but also men have to fight for it. It shouldn't just be up to women to make this case. It needs to be our male comrades as well, And more than anything else, I think what we need to do is to go back to the sort of studies that Engels and Marx were looking at, and to make use of the many important studies that have been done since. Like, I'm talking about Engels today, but that was written in the 1870s, 150 years ago, based on material that was produced in the 1840s. Since then, we've had many more studies done by, as I said earlier, Chris Nice and Jerome Lewis, many others. I mean, I would recommend comrades go to the radical anthropological groups forums, because it's just so interesting, and because it allows us to get an understanding of how our society developed from one which was based on collective ownership to one that's based on class, and the manner in which we can think more broadly about how we supersede this class-ridden society and create a new culture. And I leave it there. Thank you, Tina.
I'm sorry, I'm muted. I've been jabbering away. Sorry. Thank you very much for dividing it up like that, Anne. I think that was very useful that you looked at the historical material that they learned from and took on board and really studied. Luxembourg as well. When we discussed this issue a few weeks back, we also looked at Luxembourg's work on the issue, who actually went around and quoted from a lot of colonial scientists that went around, when the world was divided up between all different colonies, and they kept finding these societies where, they were run in a communistic way, still in the 18th, 19th centuries, in Russia, in Africa, in America, everywhere. So it wasn't just a local thing. It looked like it was a universal way of living together. I was going to pick you up on one thing, because you were talking about these early societies of Urkommunismus being matriarchies. As I understand it, I mean, there's a difference, isn't there, between matrilineal society and matriarchal society, in the sense that matrilineal is, I think, all the way through, Lenin uses matrilineal societies, and Morgan as well, to say that, they were structured, they were organized along the women in terms of the grandmother was living with the woman to support her daughter, which gave the daughter the space and the possibility to actually, have more children, etc. And other women helped women. So the grandmother theory, that they all lived together within the woman's household. But that doesn't mean that it was a matriarchy in the sense that the women were the bosses, like an inversion of today, like, the opposite of patriarchy is matriarchy. That's how it's often seen. But that wasn't the case at all, was it? It wasn't a matriarchy in the sense that women were the bosses, and like today men are bossing women around. In your view, Anne?
Oh, well, I think it was completely different, because there wasn't private property. So, like, I just think that dynamic, they didn't have anything to fight over, like, I would think that maybe on some questions women were taking the lead, or maybe were authoritative on some questions. I don't actually know, Tina, because I don't think we know how men and women, like, I think that there was, to me, that there would have been some things where women would have had more of a say on than men. And maybe when it came to issues to do with children, but I agree with you that I don't think it was women running society like that. It was like I don't think it was like a patriarchy, except it was a matriarchy, because there wasn't private property. It was a collective society. I mean, I'm only hesitating there because I know from listening to some accounts given by Jerome Lewis and others that, sometimes women were in charge, that there is an argument that there was, moving kind of power. The power shifted from the men to the women, and that they did play with power. I mean, that's been found in some tribal societies in Africa, the hunter-gatherer societies, the small number of them that continue to exist, that it's not as though that there's no concept of power, that there is, but that they kind of play with it, or that it moves between the two, between men and women. But obviously the lack of a class society and the lack of private property means that the collective itself and the needs of the collective itself is what predominates.
I mean, Chris Knight is obviously, and Camilla Power and Jerome, they also have developed the idea of the female revolution. The human revolution was female led, so that there's obviously men are stronger, have more muscles, etc. And if it's just a question of the strongest, wins or whatever, then men should be in charge in that sense. And they outlined that they think there was a time when women basically grouped together and had a sort of solidarity moment, or movement, not just a moment, and just said, no, we have to have a more equal society, and this is not how we're going to do things. And that was the moment which allowed then humanity to develop and culture to develop, the brain to become bigger, because women had the space, or they had the security that the whole tribe would look after their children and not just themselves, which is also an interesting issue to look up for if comrades are interested. Just quickly on the transition period, that is quite fascinating. I think the transition from primitive, or Urkommunismus, as Marx and Engels actually wrote, which is much nicer than primitive communism, to class society, because this is the moment which, as you said, the historic defeat of the female sex, which of course carries with it the historic defeat of all of humanity, and the democratic way and the egalitarian way in which they lived with each other. And that and the idea of abundance versus scarcity, I think, is an important issue, that we can't just go back, can we? We can't just go back to a society, or some people think that sounds quite attractive, a hunter-gatherer society, with obviously had much lower numbers. But they also came to a point of scarcity. A big game ran out, and they were starting to run into problems. And that's when the need for cattle, for settling and growing food developed. But that going forward, we would again have to get to a situation of abundance, which we haven't had for a long time through from the Urkommunismus. There's scarcity, is all the way characterized, is a characteristic of class society, that some have and lots of people have not, and that the need to move towards a society with abundance once again. What do you think about these concepts? There's an idea of the degrowth Marxism, the degrowth communism, a sort of future society which goes sort of a step back almost, and goes into producing less and to get to a degrowth rather than abundance, in the sense of we need more cars, which I don't think ever Marx would have argued for, that we need more flying and more cars and more production for production's sake. Can you see how do you the idea of abundance and degrowth, do they work together in Marxism?
Well, I think that abundance was for a long time seen as having lots of things, and the existence of the Soviet Union and its production of lots of things, lots of useless things often, or defective things, was seen as the model by many in the communist world. And remember that there was I can't remember which one of the Soviet leaders said that they were going to bury the West, you know, in goods by some stage, you know, but like, I remember when I was first involved in communist politics, the idea was that you would have, there would be so many things, you know, we would have everything. What's like the kind of the, you know, idea that everybody would have loads of luxuries, we would all be floating around, and it was just such a strange idea, really. But I think it's Khrushchev, yeah, we will bury you. Thank you, Ian. So I think that the idea of degrowth is actually an interesting one. Obviously, I don't agree with it from the point of view of small projects, but I think that if we are going to save this planet, then we do need to think about, I think we do need to think about what we need to do, and what does need mean? Does need mean having lots of things, or does need mean something else, something different culturally to us, to what capitalism tells you? Because capitalism is telling us that we can have all of these things, and yet we can model our, we can kind of develop our private behaviors to recycle, etc., 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 and that's, you know, going to solve everything. But obviously that's not what we need to do to keep the society, to keep this world alive. And I think that degrowth is an interesting idea. Like, as I say, I think that it needs to be something that's thought about, and I think that it's something that needs to be part of a political project, a socialist political project, if it is to work effectively. Like, I think I actually made a mistake when I talked about the end of the coming to an end of primitive communism. I suppose I shouldn't have called it scarcity, really, in the sense that, you know, the hunter-gatherer society, but it was definitely, would you say it was abundance? It was what was necessary for to meet the immediate needs. Like, today's hunter-gatherer societies, they only gather what they need for that day or the next few days. They don't store things. But obviously we want to be able to develop things and store things. We don't want to be in that relation to be always kind of, well, I don't think so anyway, to be always trying to live on what you have at this very moment in time. We should be able to develop a I suppose not a surplus in that sense, but we should be able to develop and store things and have things available without at the same time being mindful about what we're doing. So yeah, I think that's an interesting idea. I haven't really given you a very clear answer on.
No, I think it's an interesting discussion about what is abundance. I mean, you know, it was, I think, within the Soviet Union and until recently, abundance meant, yeah, we can all have cars, or everybody can have, you know, all Chinese people can have their own car, and everybody in India and everybody, you know, that kind of abundance is obviously that would not survive. You know, we would not survive on the planet. The planet would not survive that kind of abundance. But abundance can mean other things, can it? It can mean an abundance of time, an abundance of control over how things are done and how we decide to restructure society in a more human and egalitarian way. It doesn't mean that everybody has to have their own, you know, set of jewelry or set of private jets or whatever. So it's a, you know, I think it's a good idea to have a redefinition of those issues. Yeah, and I think I did pick you up on the scarcity thing, because I think, you know, up to a certain point, these societies, as we understand it, I'm not an anthropologist, but they lived quite well. These, you know, communistic societies, they played, they laughed, they had a good time most of the time. They worked a bit, but most of the time they just sort of lived happily within nature and in you know, in balance with nature, if you will. But that became actually perhaps too successful for its own good. So these, you know, it became more and more people, and if you have, you know, more and more people, and, you know, everybody needs to eat, and big game just started to die out. And perhaps there was also a combination with climate change that led to some dying out of big game, and then scarcity meant something else had to happen. But scarcity, I think, was a problem, but not the characteristic of most of these early societies. Comrades, if you want to come in, ask a question or make a comment, please click raise hand. Under reaction, Carol has a question or a comment. I'm just bringing you in now. If you could switch on your camera, that would be great.
And unmute myself.
You were there for a second and then your camera went off again. Sorry.
Okay. I'm trying to, there we are. I am, there I am. Okay, right. So my question was that, you know, at the moment we can see that there's saber rattling going on. We've got China and America saber rattling and threatening each other and, you know, being toxically masculine. So surely men were also engaged in warfare when we were hunter-gatherers as well. Certainly the Native American nations did go to war with each other. So would a more egalitarian society, would that mean automatically less war? Would men become less toxically masculine if we lived in that kind of society that I've really enjoyed hearing it being described, you know, by Anne today and by the radical anthropologists as well, because it seems that when society was more equal, people were much more happy, much more balanced. And you said, Anne, didn't you, that women receiving their emancipation, if you like, total emancipation, would be very good for men as well. So would we see this toxic masculinity go in such a society, and therefore war be far less likely? Or is war merely tied up with capitalism and the striving for power and resources to feed that capitalism? Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. Do you want to reply, Anne?
So as I understand it, the development towards war in early societies was as a result of surplus and wars over land and cattle. And what would happen then was that prisoners would be taken. Now, I think like, obviously, neither am I an anthropologist, so I haven't got an exact, you know, answer for you in terms of was there an overlap or not. But I would think that for certain that it would have signaled the end of the commune, you know, the implosion of the commune, for them to be becoming like more of like a clan, of a patriarchal clan, which then entered into battles with other competitors over cattle or lands and then taking prisoners. So I don't think that it was the modus operandi of men within early communism. And indeed, if you look at primitive communists, you know, the groups today, you would see that they are not war-making groups. So I don't think I agree with you on it being men being kind of innately violent or toxically macho. But like, there is an argument, I think, that Chris Knight makes, in that human beings developed from apes, and within not all ape societies, but within the ape societies we came from, the males are very confrontational and competitive, and the females are quite powerless, and in respect of any of that. But I think that the point that Tina made about Chris Knight's book and blood relations was that in terms of female solidarity, what they were doing at the time was they were claiming power over their own reproduction, over their own selves, and that this itself changed society as a whole and made it a society which wasn't, where men were not violent. So I think it's about society really, rather than it being men. I think it's about the class nature of society, rather than it being about men themselves, you know. But look, I mean, that's just like my view on it. That's how I would approach it. I think that if we just had capitalism, but with women in charge, would that make it any less violent? I just question that, but I think it's worthwhile raising.
Thanks very much, Anne.
Margaret Thatcher, etc.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, comrades, there's a question in the Q&A which I'll read out now. If you do have a question, ideally we'd prefer it if you could come in and formulate it yourself, or put it in the Q&A. I can't keep checking the chat, so if you could do that, that'd be very good. Okay, so in the Q&A, do you think that changing work roles, i.e. men taking on those roles and not just women, in relation to care and upbringing of children was discussed by Zetkin and Kollontai and within those groups? Such questions, of course, were brought up by Bertrand Russell, amongst others, or were those questions, on the contrary, regarded as bourgeois considerations in the main? I.e. do we solve this issue by having, men look after kids and do some of the cooking, etc.?
So, what I did, like Zetkin and Kollontai and others did complain about the fact that women were, left with everything to do, and actually more than that, in Rabotnitsa, which was the first women worker journal, which was produced by Bolshevik women in 1914, there was an article on Babel, who I've just spoken about, but the article didn't really go into any of his theories, except to say that he had shown through his research, through his writing on the research of Morgan, that women and men had lived in very different relations towards each other, that women's place in the home was not natural and immutable. But they also said that he was very nice to his wife, which wasn't really said in a patronizing way. What they were arguing, and they would often argue, is that men needed to relieve women of these responsibilities so that they could go to political meetings and take part in events, and that men, and I mean, this kind of does sound patronizing, but I don't think they were being patronizing, and that they should educate their wives and encourage them to think and to develop them themselves. And they talked about how Babel had done such a thing in his own marriage. So it wasn't so much, I think, the fact that they thought that men should be, I mean, they did think it, but it's not like that they put it forward as a policy for men to do half the housework or anything like that. But they definitely thought that men should give women freedom within their marriage, more freedom within their marriage, and that they should educate them and encourage them to take part in society and in public debates and to go to work and to have activities outside the home. So, but then in terms of the solution to the question of domestic labor and childcare, they saw the solution in the collectivization, and that in and of itself, at the very beginning, I'm moving on to after the Russian Revolution, is that many of the places that were set up to look after children and provide food were run by women. And indeed, Lenin, in his interview with Clara Zetkin, in 1921, said that he believes that the self-liberation of women meant women taking on these tasks, which I think he was wrong about. I don't think it should have been up to the women to create all of these alternative ways to deal with domestic labor and free women from the burdens in the home.
But that's also an interesting question in terms of individual responsibility. I mean, do you solve these issues by, giving men, making men feel shit or whatever, you have to step up, whereas it's a question of how we run society. So it's not our individual fault that, you know, the planet is dying. It's, you know, I might go on holiday once a year, and, you know, the Green Party will give me a lot of you know, bad feelings about it, and I should feel like really guilty about it, when it's in fact, you know, it is the way capitalism is working. So that wouldn't change things quite dramatically, I don't think. Anyway, Ian's got a question. Hi, comrade.
Good evening, comrades. Thank you. That was I thoroughly enjoyed it. I've always been fascinated by Engels' book, and I wanted to ask two things really. One is about wider gender relations, as it were. At one point, Engels talks about the abomination of pederasty in ancient Greece, and of course, what he was referring to was sexual relations between a young apprentice soldier, say in ancient Sparta, and an older man who was a seasoned fighter. And of course, Geoffrey de Saint-Croix in his class struggle in the ancient Greek world talks about the way in which men and women constituted different classes in ancient Greece. And actually some of the ancient Greek literature, such as the Oedipus Rex and so on, is precisely dealing with the tensions that were in society between the transition from matrilineal to patrilineal society due to changes in private property relations. So I wonder whether you could say a bit more about sex and sexuality in the context of Engels' work, because I was always intrigued by this idea, because it does open up the possibility that expressions of sexuality are themselves historically contingent in just the way the family is. And of course, that's a highly contentious issue at the moment. Another one I wanted to throw in was something which is completely speculative on my part, and it relates to sexual dimorphism in humans and beyond. Sexual dimorphism is where you get a difference between the male and the female in terms of size and strength and so on. And at one extreme end, you've got baboons, for example, where the male is huge, aggressive, and so on. And in marmosets, well, almost no difference. And you can see differences in sexual relations. Marmosets, you know, females have as many male partners as they want, and in baboons, it's the male that tends to be promiscuous. What's unique about humans, of course, is that we could be in control of our own evolution. And Engels in the Dialectics of Nature talks about this, and it's one of the, and although the book itself was limited by his knowledge, and of course, and a lot's happened since, it does open up this fascinating prospect. So if we think about human big brains are the result of our ability to cook food and therefore feed a bigger power-hungry brain, and we do that at the expense of having a smaller gut and so on, how humans have changed their own evolution, does it open up the possibility that humans could, over time, on an evolutionary scale, actually change things like the very physical composition of our societies to make it more egalitarian? It's purely speculative, but if it's a logical thing that would follow from Engels' Dialectics of Nature, I would argue. Throw that in. Thank you.
Go on, Anne, develop that one.
Do I have to come back now?
You could regard me as completely deranged, which
No.
you wouldn't be alone in that one.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So on Engels and pederasty, and Engels on sexuality. So I always think of him and Babel together. I don't know why, but because I think that they've come from the same general political direction, and also because they are of the same class and reflect their own life and environment, because they just seem quite contradictory to me. Obviously, Engels, to some extent, is critiquing exploitation, isn't he, of the young boys? But also, there seems to me that there's an element of aversion to homosexuality. And also, Babels talks about having, about healthy human relations a lot. And he, to me, seems to be also antagonistic towards same-sex relations between men. But that's contradicted by the fact that he actually, in the Reichstag, calls for the decriminalization of homosexuality. He has a kind of, he has this thing about healthy human relations. And although Engels doesn't say this, I don't know whether you recall this whole drink of water analogy that Kollontai was meant to have made, that Lenin condemned her for. He said, but anyway, so it was Babel that said it in the first place, that sexual relations between human beings should be as natural a thing as drinking a glass of water, that there should be nothing surrounding it in terms of jealousy or ownership or control, or like that. It should be as natural as that, as natural as any other human need, which I always thought was quite interesting. While at the same time he was talking about healthy human relations in a way that seemed to me to be antagonistic towards homosexuality. And then Engels, he has been talked about as being more of a romantic about relations. He seems to believe that the old, patriarchal form of the family is on the way out, but what the future holds is free relations between men and women, and the kind of a pairing relationship between a man and a woman, which will be equal and be nothing to do with the state, of course. So but Engels is an interesting individual in terms of how he lived his own life, and I think he definitely they both had an idea that they wanted to liberate relationships between human beings, and that they were like contradictory, but also very progressive on the whole question of the human brain and the way in which humanity was able to shift from a society of where we were apes to humans, and that's just very interesting, because Chris Knight's thesis is that it was the women who did this by taking control of their own reproduction, and therefore shifted society from one where we of a kind of an unplanned nature, where the male was dominant and women had no control over their reproduction and weren't in a position to develop a human being, who needed this and that, and who needed time to be devoted to them, to care for them, in order that they could develop this brain and be healthy, etc., etc. But I don't know about it being something that could or should be repeated.
Well,
maybe I'm not really getting what you're saying.
Well, that's really interesting, because if you think about it, humans are not that sexually dimorphic. We're far less so than chimpanzees, far less so, even much less so than gorillas, for example. I mean, evolutionary scale is a long one, but not always. What I find interesting about it is, if that's true, if it's women that have driven that change towards a bigger brain, and maybe it's contributed to the limiting of sexual dimorphism, and ultimately we would have control over that. And there's no reason to think that if we've controlled our evolution, which is what that suggests, that we won't continue to do so, and effectively not by some sort of horrible Orwellian image, but successively breed nicer people. Anyway.
Let's try, shall we?
Let's get started.
Thanks, Ian. Minnie, please.
Thank you, Anne, for the talk, and thanks, Tina, for chairing. Just what I want to, and the last section just went completely over me, actually. Right, I'm interested in what Marx and his equations and the reproduction of the working class and the role that women played in that. Now, I know that women worked a lot during that time as well, and in really bad conditions, and that Marx and Engels, they supported women. They wanted women to publish. They didn't want women to have to work with, dangerous materials, just as they wouldn't want men to, etc., etc. And I think that's an excellent point you make, Anne, about the socialism, not feminism, but us all working together, and how much we're missing. But about the equations on the surplus value thing, you've got the variable capital, you've got the constant capital, and then you've got the surplus, the production and the surplus. I know that the reproduction of the working class is kind of privatized in a way, but it didn't appear in the equations. And of course, I'm looking from the 21st century. Well, we're supposed to be living in the 21st century, aren't we? So I'm looking at it from where I am. But it just kind of disappoints me that free labor wasn't factored into the equations, or also that it's going backwards for women now, that women are having to give up work because childcare is becoming so expensive that women are having to give up work, and we're going backwards. So it's a very dangerous time, and what with women's reproductive rights, etc. On the toxicity of men, I think that the system causes so much of that, and that basically capitalism is a war machine and goes to war over resources and competition when it doesn't need to, because it's like one nation's got to be, we've got America at the moment, the supreme nation, warring with everyone when they don't need to. And other nations, China, doing it in different ways. Going in with a more capitalist approach. Well, we'll do this, we'll get sort of into your society. But I think a lot of that, and with scarcity, obviously I've been reading about Hillel Ticktin and about what would a socialist society look like. One of his prerequisites for a socialist society, which socialism and communism together, similar term, but he uses socialism, is relative abundance. And one of the first things that would be done in a socialist society would be, of course, not everyone's going to have a car. We can't all have cars. It's bad for the planet. So it would be public transport, getting people moving around in green energy, public transport, etc. So, of course, a socialist society is going to be built so differently and factor other things in, similarly with men and women. But I've got this little thing about the universal suffrage thing, and I know, again, I'm looking from the 21st century. So I know that Marx and Engels supported women's rights. They noted that in the American labor movement, women had a lot of rights, and they're again in the labor movement now. Childcare prevents women from taking place in branch meetings, although I would think things may be improving with Zoom and stuff like that, but nevertheless the women aren't getting out to the meetings to participate as much. So with universal suffrage, I know that Marx's democracy, we've been looking at democracy, was more about a different kind of participative democracy rather than the parliamentary democracy, but his model was the Paris Commune, and that didn't have suffrage for women. So, and I've been looking all week, where I've read an article by Hal Draper and something else. I've been looking, where did Marx and Engels ever say, let's have suffrage for women? And I can't see that was said, and I just find that a bit disappointing. Yeah, and also on the physical strength of men and women. Of course, men should use their physical strength, but in great ways, in sport, etc. And so should women. But when mining, machines will be doing mining, machines will be doing so many things. Society's changing anyway with technology developing under capitalism, which means we can move into socialism and a more equal society. So I don't think, and obviously with the advertising industry, women being used to advertise cars and what we're put out to be in the conditioning of capitalism, that's all going to end and things will change and we'll have equality. Thank you.
Thank you, Minnie. Emma, Anne, we've got two more speakers. Do you want to hear them or do you want to reply now? Sorry, you're muted.
It's up to you, Chair. Do you want to take them? I mean, there's like, Minnie has raised a lot of interesting stuff.
Yeah, okay, just answer, yeah. Best
Okay, okay. So, okay, so on the question of suffrage, yeah, I actually looked at it myself and I couldn't see anything. But what seems to be the case, if you look at the Second International, so Engels was still alive when the Second International was formed, and I think he spoke at maybe the first or the second one, I can't remember which. Anyway, he was very influential on Eleanor Marx, who went as a representative of the gas workers union in Britain, and he also was influential on Louise Kautsky, who was Kautsky's first wife, who was an Austrian who came to work for Engels as his housekeeper. Anyway, so he would have been very influential on them, but I haven't seen what he said on the question of the vote. I mean, certainly if you read The Origin of the Family, you'll see him arguing that, you know, women's political rights, equality needs to be at the forefront of what the workers' state does. But it does seem to me that Clara Zetkin was the one that really made this happen, and that she was the one who transformed the struggle for suffrage into something which was at the heart of the socialist movement of the Second International, because she made women's suffrage about socialism, about women, about the fight for political rights for women being part and parcel of the struggle for socialism, and it being something that was revolutionary as opposed to reformist. And I think that for many, if you look at the early resolutions of the Second International, you will see that they focused on rights for women within the workplace and social rights for women rather than political rights. So I think that, to me, that seems that's what happened, is that she made that happen. That she picked up that question and fought for it, but that it hadn't been fought. Now, I haven't read Kautsky on the question, so I don't know what he was saying. And I would say that probably within the SDP, this was an issue, because I know that women weren't allowed to be involved in politics up to when they weren't allowed to be in political parties, up to when early 1900s in Germany. But I think it will be interesting to see what happened in Germany around the question of suffrage. But yeah, it's an interesting point to make, and I think that it's, you know, yeah, something that we can criticize Marx and Engels for, because it does seem to be absent from their writings.
Thank you. Rob, please.
Hi. Yeah, so thank you for your talk, first of all. It's really good to get this perspective reinforced. I enjoyed hearing it at the last meeting we had on it, Paper Communists, and kind of like looking at, you know, these kind of alternative angles to anthropology. I think it's particularly important that we do that. But I do have some questions about it, and I'd hope that yourself or Tina could help clear those up. And namely, in the kind of universality of the kind of matrilineal family, and, you know, how these relations have shaped human evolution. You you know, the idea that it was the, you know, women holding back from reproduction increased cranial capacity. You know, at what point, you know, kind of at what point was that decision made, and how did it impact the whole of human evolution? It's a, you know, given the pluralistic nature of human society, the fact that there are so many different constructs and so many different ways in which it can manifest, how can we concretely say that an event like that would take place that would impact on the whole in such a big way? I would also ask about how you know, this kind of movement from eco-communists into you know, the kind of barbarism and, you know, the kind of progression from there that's proposed by Engels, how that relates to primitive accumulation. You know, the idea that that was a historical time in which industrial relations were then spread across the world, and people were removed from the means of production and alienated from the land, and then replaced with the industrial relations of capital. You know, how do those two kind of theories marry up together? Because it, you know, it sounds like there's a, you know, a kind of necessary progression in Engels, that it moves from one stage to the next stage to the next stage. But then it is primitive accumulation and like a big leap in that development, or is that, you know? And so on that account, you know, that kind of brings me forward into the next kind of part of it. And I agree with the points you were making, and I agree with the kind of Rosa Luxemburg position on feminism. And I kind of revised comments I made in the last meeting, you know, where I declared myself a feminist. But I would say now, I would agree more concretely that emancipation of the genders and of the sexes is only possible in a socialist society, and therefore we shouldn't sectionalize ourselves off into struggle from a particular feminist position, and that we should be all socialists together, and that's the best way to move forward. I think that's a better way of putting it than any clumsy attempts I've made.
Thank you, Rob. Are you stuck, or have you stopped speaking? I think you maybe both. Rob, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, there you go. So you were stuck, I think, for a bit.
Yeah. Sorry. Oh, now my camera's doing the thing. Hold on, I'll just stop my video.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry. Yeah. So I would say that how much is, you know, kind of the Abrahamic religions approach towards gender relations impacted on the gender relations within communism? Not communism, sorry, capitalism. Because obviously the West was the birthplace of capitalism, and the West was also full of the kind of ideology of the Abrahamic religions, particularly obviously Christianity, but also wider influences from others. So how far has that embedded misogyny led to the position of women in that society? And, you know, does that kind of, and again, how does that marry up with the kind of anthropological argument? You know, can we acknowledge how those two, you know, is the anthropology, that's my point really. Yes, I think those are my kind of main questions about it. I just want that clearing up about the universality and how we can concretely say that there is this development, and how much of it isn't just a product of Western capitalism, which is in itself inherently misogynistic. Thanks.
Thank you, Rob. Do you want to reply to that, Anne? You want to take Steve? Yeah, Steve. Okay, and then we can have a reply and summing up. Right, if there's anybody else who would like to ask a question or make a comment, please click raise hand. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Tina. Hi, and thank you very much for your talk. And I largely agree with it. I'm just going to maybe emphasize. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, but I just wanted to emphasize a theme that we've been pursuing over the past period. The idea that Republican communists put the emphasis on political questions, on political and social questions, and give a priority, therefore, to the fight for democracy, including the need to replace the existing state with a democratic republic. Therefore, we have to think, what does that democratic republic mean in the struggle for women's liberation? Because I would argue that if a democratic republic won't achieve women's liberation, it would be a major boost forward. It would be a major, as it were, leap forward. So we have to sort of now, and I'm going to come back to the bigger picture that you began with. So the question might be, you know, can women ever be liberated from a position of being second-class citizens? And the answer that you gave, and I agree with, is yes, because in a sense, women were already equal. It's already been achieved in the past in a different kind of society. Therefore, it's not a biological question. It's a social question. It's about social conditions which can be changed. So that's the importance of Engels, and that's the importance of Chris Knight and all the things that you've emphasized, that women's liberation is completely possible and not ruled out. But of course, women's oppression predated capitalism. So the question is, can capitalism liberate women? Now, we have to think about that and not go, well, obviously not because we're socialists. I mean, that would be the simple thing. But I think there is a sense in which, in theory, capital doesn't really, in its search for surplus value, doesn't care whether you're a woman, whether you're black, what you know, what your sexuality, doesn't care about any of these things. It just cares about exploiting you. So in a way, capitalism, as long as it can exploit people, doesn't particularly care. So in a certain sense, maybe capitalism in its search for surplus value is sort of liberating women. But then the answer to it, I think, is no, because capitalism depends on keeping people divided. Therefore, it needs divide and rule. Therefore, it needs to maintain these divisions within the workforce. It needs to keep emphasizing them to keep the workforce under control. So although if in theory it could liberate women, in practice it cannot do so for those kind of reasons. And then I'll just move on to the next point, which is that there are different approaches to women's liberation. I know that from my own political background, and I will talk about economistic Marxism, which we've seen a lot of that in the past, that the women's question is seen as a diversion from the class struggle. There's a class struggle going on. And if we start going into these questions of women's liberation, they are secondary questions, okay? The main question is the class struggle, and the women's struggle, as it were, for equality is a secondary question. Now, I don't agree with that, by the way, but there's always been a strong strain within Marxism to think about the class struggle as meaning the economic struggle in the workplace rather than the political struggle. Whereas if you see it as a democratic question, you see it as part of the struggle for democracy, then it doesn't become a secondary question, it becomes a primary question. And therefore, the distinction between being a Democrat and being a feminist is that a feminist thinks it's a single issue, and a Democrat thinks it's one of many issues of oppression that we have to fight all of them on all fronts, because they're all very, very important. And then that leads me to the final point, is this, is that therefore, the democratic fight has to be incorporated into the minimum program, because the minimum program should include all those fights for rights in the here and now, which in and of themselves don't liberate women, like the right for women to have the vote. I mean, women having the vote hasn't liberated women, okay? But the fight for women to have the vote, or anything else you want to talk about for women's equality, is absolutely, should be part of the minimum program, i.e. for the part of the fight in the here and now, not to be put off till communism arrives, but to be done now. And in that sense, it leads us towards communism. I'll stop there.
Interesting point, Steve. Thank you. Steve was the last person from the floor. So if you want to reply to a few things now, and sum up as well, you've got up to 25 minutes. So I don't think you're going to use that much yet.
Oh, really? No. Okay, so all right. So first, Rob, on the universality of matrilineal society, and then about the human revolution. So the two things are separate, as is my understanding, and secondly, the theory which has been put forward initially by Chris Knight in his book Blood Relations, I think it's definitely worth reading, or going to the site for the RAG, Radical Anthropological Group, and also looking at the talks and articles from Camilla Power, particularly because she's very interesting on this question. So the theory goes is that pre-humans were apes. We don't know how kind of much they look like us or anything like that, but that the way in which the ape society operated meant that it was unable to progress to a more a higher kind of I'm going to just reword that it was unable to produce sufficiently for the humanity to become more developed, we'll say, to shift, to become human, for apes to become human. They needed, women needed to be able to devote a sufficient time to rearing the child and having the time to feed and provide for, to be able to look after this child for at least, a year. Because, like, whereas ape societies, the young are not so dependent for such a long time on their mothers in the same way as babies are dependent on human mothers. So to be able to do that, the females of that society needed to do something to change, and that's all about controlling reproduction. It's all about dark moon, full moon. I mean, you'd have to read Chris Knight to see how he develops that theory and how important the moon was, how important nature was to the way in which human society moved from being ape-like to being more collective and to being, as you say, matrilineal. And his argument would be that perhaps because women took the lead in this, that the society that developed related to the woman and was matrilineal because of that. And the being matrilineal, as Tina has said, was that it was that, how you traced yourself back was through your mother and through your mother's family. So I don't know whether that gives you any kind of an answer, but that, like, obviously we don't know the specifics of this. It seems to be the case that it's been evidenced by the existence of things like red ochre and other proof that the radical anthropological society point to. So they say it was the first human revolution, and that it made us into humans and was led by women. So then on...
Can we just add maybe quickly something on the universality, which is an interesting question, isn't it? Because we find evidence everywhere of these societies, and humans obviously developed throughout the planet. I mean, there's of course the out of Africa idea, so that it wasn't, we didn't just all evolve, humanity didn't just all evolve and all over the world at the same time, but there was it started somewhere out of Africa, and that can be shown. There's research that shows where you can follow the lineage of where that all started. And that, as with the why aren't the Neanderthals there anymore, is that some societies are more successful than others, and that this way of living and rearing and developing, having it's all about brain size, isn't it? That if you look after your child for longer, it can develop a bigger brain, etc. That led to culture, that led to language, that led to cooking, all sorts of things that develop with that, and that is clearly an evolutionary advantage if you can do those sort of things, and that this spreads and is nature it has an advantage in nature to spread more than the societies where this doesn't happen. So I don't think it happened everywhere at the same time, a revolution across the world, but I think it's that kind of goes to that answer a little bit.
Yeah,
Actually,
thanks,
sorry.
Tina. So in terms of, actually, I see a point there in the chat about human childcare being collective, has to be collective. And I mean, I agree with that. I think that successful human societies are those that collectivize childcare, because as long as childcare is just done within the home by one woman, it's like really, you know, far from what we need for the children themselves, you know, to be isolated in the home with just their mother is not good. I think it's very important for children to be able to socialize from a young age, as well as for women or men, whoever is looking after the children, to be able to come together and, you know, discuss and do things. It makes absolute sense. I mean, people try to do that in today's society, but it's very difficult because they have to pay for childcare, and also because of the fact that so many other things that we need to do in order to reproduce ourselves on a daily basis have to be done individually, because there are not the collective solutions for us to use. Then I think Rob talked about Abrahamism, I think, wasn't it, about the role of religion? Yeah, and I think that's a very interesting point, the role of Christianity in the development of a misogynist society and in the oppression of women. I mean, you know, I think that's a whole other debate that we really should have, and we discuss the relationship of religion to society and the development of society once, like perhaps most importantly within medieval times, when when the church was dominant in a way that it was less so after the development of capitalism. But yeah, it's obviously continues to be extremely important in today's world, the role of religion, with the use of religion to make women, to oppress women. Anyway, then just finally on on Steve's points. So yeah, I mean, it's right to say that, of course, as far as the capitalist machine is concerned, it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. Once you can press the button or, you know, do whatever you need to do as a worker. But isn't it interesting how much it actually matters to the capitalist class and the capitalist state in reality? And to me, what seems to be at the crux of it is the need to control women's sexuality and to control women's reproduction. Like, you know, today look at the United States and the fact that, you know, it's gone back, you know, decades in terms of women's rights to control their own reproduction. And you think, well, you know, like, how does that happen? If you have a view of society that progress is inevitable, then clearly that scotches that idea. Why would they want to do this? Why do the far right in the United States, why does the governing the various states in the United States want to control women? Why does it want to ban abortion? Is it concerned with population, or is it just concerned with women's rights and the fact that they want women in the home and to kind of recreate some kind of a 1950s society? I don't know the answers to all of those, but I think that there are issues we should discuss, because otherwise, you know, we're not really kind of taking note of what's going on around us. And I mean, I agree with you that democracy is an essential question. Like, in fact, the Zhenotdel, which is the organization I've studied, the Women's Bureau of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, in its leadership included some of the strongest oppositionists in the early Russian Soviet Republic. So even, you know, in the at the beginning, the Zhenotdel leaders were removed Colin was removed over the workers' opposition, which, you know, sometimes people on the left scoff at and say that it was just about, you know, the workers' opposition was the opposition to the new economic policy, and it argued for the trade unions to take the dominant role in production, and it made proposals which were really unsuitable. But at the same time, what it was saying, and what she was saying, was that society is becoming more bureaucratized. New economic policy means that women are losing their jobs. So we're going backwards. We need women involved in the workplace. We need them being able to take part in society as workers, as Soviet citizens. So we need democracy. Then later, one of the leaders, Nikolaeva, she was also removed from her role as the chair of the Zhenotdel because she was involved with Zinoviev and others. I think was it the Leningrad opposition, which, you know, you can criticize, but it was because she opposed the way society was becoming more bureaucratized. So you could see in reality how their work in the Zhenotdel was not divorced from what was going on in the rest of society, but it just simply reflected it in a different way and showed that for them it was so important for there to be a collective approach to resolving questions and a democratic one. Anyway, so look, I'm just going to finish there, and well in time. Yes. And thank you all. I've really enjoyed it. And I hope that we can maybe have more discussions, maybe not exactly on the woman question and Marxism, but maybe on the question of the family, the relationship of the family to capitalism. Obviously, that's something that's embedded within Marx's own work as well, and that could be looked at. But, you know, I very much enjoyed this evening. Thank you very much.
I think we all did. Thank you very much, Anne. It's we've got almost as many people in the audience still that we had at the beginning, which is unusual. There's always people dropping out, but we've got over 60 people there, so excellent work. Thank you very much, Anne. Next week, comrades, hopefully you can join us. Roger Silverman will be talking about Marx and his work in the First International, which also touches, of course, on party building in general, because often Marx and Engels are being portrayed as, you know, theoreticians. They sat in the British Library and did their thing there, but they were very closely involved, not just in the revolutions of their time, but also party building and the need to get together on a clear political socialist program. So we'll be discussing that next week, and then we're going to have a session on Marx and the monarchy with Ian Spencer and Kevin Bean a couple of days before the coronation shenanigans. If you're in London, there will be people going to that protest organized by Republic, but with their own banners, which is, I think, is a good attitude. Republic is a very strange bourgeois Guardian type campaign, but certainly would be a good opportunity to put forward our own issues and demands, etc., to do away with monarchy. Thank you very much, Anne. Thank you very much, comrades. Have a good evening and see you next week. Bye-bye.